Well, busy Elixir acoustics, and what we've got today is Neil's Taylor baby in for a little setup, and I've got something in this bag that I will show you in a minute. Okay, so here we have, this is the BT2e mahogany Taylor, and you've seen these before. Is that sustain? This these guitars resonate. I think it's the on the A. Beautiful tone, absolutely gorgeous. And yeah, lovely guitar, mahogany top and sides and back. They've got the little bolt-on neck, you've seen this before. This one's got the under saddle piezos with a little electronics department. But yeah, just a gorgeous tone. Now let's just do two things. Let's just tune this again. Now this is unscientific. So look, what have we got? What are we presented with? Well, a lovely looking, very new, very well kept, looked after BT2e with the E, ooh. Make it ring. Sorry, I sound like an ape. If you see me doing these BT baby Taylors before, you'll know I grunt like an ape to make them sing. Anyway, this is a very nice little guitar, bolt-on neck with has shims underneath there. So if you want to adjust the neck position, you can add shims under there. Oops, there's my phone. You get factory ones, or you can take the neck off and make your own shims to go under there to change the angle of the neck. Obviously, you need to make a wedge if you're going to. It's not just about lifting the neck up. To change the action on this, you'd need to cant the end of the neck up a little bit. But the first thing that strikes me about this is, apart from the fact it's in lovely condition, the first thing that struck me was, right, the action's pretty high, and you know, this is about 6 months old, this unit, from the shop. 6 months. It's been kept at home and taken on a couple of trips, but nowhere unduly taxing. And we have currently an action standing at, if I can read it, 4 4.5 millimeters. I'm going to put my other glasses on to just see this clearly, because it's a little bit difficult to see. I've got the lights pointing in all the right directions, but okay, that's 2.3, about 4 actually, 4 millimeters on the low E and 3 on the high. So I'm going to write that down as I like to do. Low E 4 mils, high E 3 mils, and that's pretty high for an acoustic like this. The other thing is, let's see what we've got in terms of neck relief. A little, and no more or less than is required, which is good. I'd say that's pretty spot on. But the thing that I've spotted straight away about this, and it's so common, and it's common to so many guitars that I see and that anybody else sees. Let's get a slightly smaller ruler. Sorry, the reason this is so untidy in here is that we've got family coming down and I've got to move everything around, and I've also got some new stuff coming, like my buffing machines and my buffing wheels, and I've got a pile of guitars that have arrived for working on, which is great, but it's all go. Anyway, the thing I noticed straight away about this guitar is the high action. So I'm going to see if you can see it from the bass side. Just try and line it up so you can get a look. Okay, it's pretty high to play. And then the other thing, I don't know if you can see, just looking at this sideways, is when you're looking at it sideways on the action, there's a little lifting of the bridge on the corners here. Here. Vibrate. Ooh. Mm. Ooh. Ooh. Yeah. Anyway, the bridge is lifting at the corners. Now, why is the bridge lifting at the corners? Well, it's for a particular reason, and I'll show you. Sorry about this. I'm trying to give you a good angle. Straight edge. I'm trying to see what you see, but I can't. Look behind, so putting this straight edge gently down behind the bridge, can you see how definitely not flat that is? Now, it is any number of ways you can measure it. You could hold it down there and measure it just like that by saying, okay, the gap at the far end is X, or you could sort of balance it, split the difference and do it halfway, but to be honest you'd be wobbling all over the place. So kind of, well, it's two things you'll see is, one is that it's X at that end. There's also a kind of gap down there where it comes up and down and then back to the edge, so it's kind of but basically this is bellying up, and because this is curving, because of the curvature, it's lifting up from it's no longer a flat surface, so these edges are no longer touching the flat surface. And on top of that, you've got a huge load of strings pulling that way as well. So the combination of those things in acoustic guitars, and you can see it, the line of the bridge is slightly tilted up. And from what I've discovered, as much as I've discovered over the last couple of years, is this is down to humidity, excess humidity. I mean, the bottom line is that the guitar was designed to carry, you know, the load of these strings. It's not because these strings are overpowering the bridge or the top. I mean, technically, yes, now they are, and eventually, providing the humidity stays or it gets worse, this bridge will try and pivot around its front edge, and it will eventually do it, and you'll end up with a bridge that's separated up from the top, and the action will be unplayably high, and it's heading in that direction, although it's early on in its sort of pulling off. But the more curved the top is, and the more humidity and the more force there is on the strings, the more this bridge is going to come up. On the other hand, you know, you've got a guitar like this, which is about 50 odd years old, and instead of the top bellying up, because well, first of all, because this is meant to be a flat top. The reason bellies is when the flat top absorbs water, it has to expand as a material and it's got nowhere to go, so it has to go upwards. Whereas this one has a completely different construction for a couple of things. First of all, the strings are anchored to the end, so they're never pulling upwards on the bridge. Also, it's arched already, and I guess if it takes in any moisture and expands, it will raise the action, but in raising the action it doesn't do any harm to the bridge, which is floating anyway, okay, because of the design. Now this is 50 years old, and what it did do was the force of the strings over the years broke the seal here, and the integrity of the guitar collapsed, so the neck kind of pressed, actually it pulled that way, so the neck pulled away from, well, that stayed attached, but it broke this apart, and this part here sank inside the lip or the edge of the body. And so what you got was an incredibly high action. Now I've glued those together, and I've just had it kind of on test really for the last couple of weeks, just to see. There is the work I still have to do on the neck, but the point is the loading, having fixed the damage that the loading originally did, the loading is now pretty ineffective on this guitar. So the point I'm trying to get is, in 50 years, string loading alone may deform the guitar, and often you'll see guitars, very old guitars, even without humidity problems, needing the neck reset because the string loading has changed the whole geometry over the years. 6 months old and with a slightly bellying top, that's a humidity issue, but it helps the work of the strings, which is always trying to pull that way. And if the two things can conspire quite early on to pull this bridge off, as I say, I could probably just demonstrate something you really wouldn't want to see, which is that. Ideally you wouldn't want that at all, but that's only happening because of the curvature of the top. The bridge isn't breaking as such, but the curvature is by definition forcing the glue joint to come apart, and it will continue to do that wicked work. Now the question is, what can you do? Well, a wardrobe dehumidifier is a good start. If you can do it, take your guitar to a good guitar shop, and if you do have this bellying problem, they'll put it in their dehumidification cabinet, and I don't know, in about a week's time you should be able to get it back and it will be flat. It's funny enough, Robert Taylor, I saw a video where he was talking about humidity once, and he made what seemed like quite an overarching claim. His point of view was that 95 or something % of all setup problems on an acoustic guitar like this were the result of incorrect humidity, and I thought that was a bit of a sweeping statement. However, everybody that I've, not a huge number, but everybody so far, 100% of the small number of people that I have recommended taking their guitar for proper dehumidification has reported that in a short period of time the top definitely flattens out and the action definitely then returns to closer to where it should be, and that's a success story. So with a customer like Neil, what I'm going to recommend is, to begin with, if you're not going to book, if it's not convenient to take it to a music shop and book it into their cabinet, keep one of these in the case. Now the Taylor case, as you can see, is the famous soft case. I've got to be careful, I've got about 3 of these at home with all my different guitars in it, but the Taylor case is kind of padded, but it's obviously not watertight. So you know, it still technically subject to moisture, but I've got one of these in my Taylor case, and I had a little bit of humidity problem. In fact, the bellying on my guitar is nowhere near as bad as this, and yeah, I've kept mine for about 10 years now in this damp southwest England location. So maybe I just got lucky, or maybe indoors it's reasonably not humid, whatever the word is. Anyway, but the point is, I still want to get that little bit of bellying out. So even on my guitar, I've put one of these in the guitar case. Well, what I've done is I put the guitar in its case, and I've hung the little, actually I've done it like this. I've hung the little thing over there, so it sits there like that in the case. And this has a bunch of desiccant in here, but it also has a little bag to collect water. And the truth is, the first thing has to happen is all the desiccant soaks up all the water eventually and gets hard, and then when it's saturated it leaches the water into the bag, and then you know you've got to change it. Well, the bag is the kind of overflow, but at the moment mine upstairs in my case has only just about reached the state where it's getting a little bit crunchy. You can feel clumps sticking together, which is good news because it's taking moisture out of that environment. So I'm going to include this as a low-cost starter for Neil in his guitar case on the way back, and hopefully, you know, it'll start having some effect. Now, what I recommend with a guitar like this, there are a couple of things you can do. It's kind of about sussing out what the problem is. So we've got a high action. We could fix that in one of two ways. We can either reduce the saddle and get a better playing action that way, which is an option, a simpler option. We could change the shim on the neck and get a higher cant of the neck, so we'd kick the angle up at the back. That's another possibility. Now the question is those are, if you just weigh them up against each other, which one would I go for? Well, got to think of it in the bigger picture. So the bigger picture is we want this to reduce in humidity and for the top to flatten out some more. So what I would rather do is I would rather, let's say if we do that and if that's successful, I would rather do an action adjustment now, that when in the ideal world the dehumidification was successful, that we then weren't stuck with a major issue to adjust the setup. So of the two things here, the simpler one to make an adjustment at the beginning is the saddle, because let's say we reduce the saddle right now, and we obviously not down, we're going to keep it cognizant of a reasonable amount of break angle, i.e. force on the saddle to transmit both through to the guitar and to the piezo underneath, but we can still reduce the playing action a fair amount here without needing to add any shims into here. Now what that means is by the time then this flattens out a little bit more, what will happen is the bridge will sit further down, it'll come back down with the top, and that low action will get then lower and lower, at which point you have an option of putting a couple of thin shims of plastic material or a piece of tin or something, or brass or whatever you've got, cut to the exact size of the slot, and you can put that in between, providing it fits snugly to the profile or the footprint of the bridge saddle. Then actually you can put a fairly big shim in there to bring the action back out, or you can put a series of little shims in until this is stabilized and it's back flat. Now then you might want to go and get yourself a different saddle altogether, a taller one for example, because this will now be sitting down lower. So I think all of those things are easier for Neil to do than for me to put a different shim in there or add a shim into there now, which will then later on require him to take it out by taking the neck apart. So, you know, it's a difference between a replacement saddle later on and removing a shim. As I say, it's possible to do either or. A shim in here, the difficulty of doing a shim in the workshop-y type thing is that a shim to do this is very difficult to manufacture with non-precision electrical bits and bobs. So getting a perfect wedge of hardwood or ply or whatever it is you might want to use, getting a perfect wedge cut out of that, which continues progressively right down to its end, is difficult. Alternatively, you can do a simpler shim with a piece of metal or something insert, or a piece of plastic. Some people get absolutely freaked out about that. They think that a shim of a limited size and thickness, like for example, let's take an example. Some people, and I'm not sure I'm convinced by this, but let's say some people think if you take a shim like this piece of copper and you stick it under there, and then use that to kick up the end of the neck. Some people are absolutely convinced that the neck, when it sits back on that shim like that, convinced that when you put pressure on that, the neck will then bow and fill this gap and it will bend into the gap. Now technically you could imagine that if it was like that, you might say, well, yeah, maybe there's some argument to that, you know, put a load of pressure on that and while it will sit up at this end, yeah, you know, maybe if we're screwing down into that, that would pull this and warp it into the hole, possibly. It is why people, that's one of the reasons why people like to use a custom made shim, and why Taylor has them custom made to the right sizes and angles. But the other reason is that people also don't like creating an air gap between the pocket and the neck heel. So, you know, there's your air gap, you can see it through there. You know, that's kind of tends to be what you get. Now, a lot of people will argue that that lessens the tone or some sort of thing, and I don't think there's a lot of good science in my perspective, in my view, that backs it up. But I get that people would like a solid wood-to-wood fix. So in this case, what I'm going to look at is, I'm looking at this visually and seeing what have we got to play with here. We've got quite a tall bridge saddle as it is. We've got an action here of 4mm, and to be honest, I would be aiming for a 2.5mm action on the Taylors and a 2 on the target of 2.5 and 2 on the low, E, 2 on the high, which means a 1.5mm reduction and a minus 1.5 on the bass end and a -1 on the treble end at this measure, as measured it here. Now that obviously is, well, I was going to say it's not. There's the halfway distance there, so it's not double the amount, and it's not 1.75 the amount. It's a little bit less than the amount. So it's 1 point. Let's see if that's 1 point. This is crudely. If that, I haven't worked this out mathematically. If that was 1.7, that's 1 for 1. That's 2 to 1. That's 1.75 to 1. Then this would be 1.5, 1.75. No, come on, help me out. Sorry, that would be 1.5, wouldn't it? 1.5, 1, 1.5, 1.75, 1.5, 1, 1 to 1. So we're looking at about 1.25. 1.25. I'm trying to just get a gauge. I never normally work this out. I usually do it by eye or by feel. So what I know is that if I'm taking a millimetre off here, it doesn't translate into a millimetre there. It translates into less than a millimetre there because it's part of a triangle. Somebody said the other day, well, if it's you know, if your last fret is 1.5 times the way along, or it's 150%, then it's 1.5 times 2.1.5, 1.25. So let's just call it 1.3 for the fun of it, just to be on the thing exact. So it's times a factor of 1.3. So what we're saying is, if we want to reduce 1.5, I suppose I get a calculator. I'm no good at adding up maths. Let's get a calculator that isn't going to deafen. Oh no, photos. I don't want to see those. Come on. Thumbprint. Hopefully it doesn't make too much noise. Come on, come on. Alright, what was it? Calculator. Okay, so clear. We're saying we're going to lose on the base end 1.5 millimeters times 1.3. That's 1.95 reduction on the base end. 1.95 millimeters reduction on the base end, and then this one is 1 times 1.3, which is 1.3. 1.3, 1.95, and then up there 1.3. Okay, so that would give me 1.3 off the bridge. The treble end would give me 1 millimeter reduction here. 1.95 off the bridge here would give me a 1 millimeter reduction there. Sorry, a 1.5 millimeter reduction. Okay, it's logical, isn't it? Anyway, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take that down a bit, but I'm going to take a look at it and just see what the 1.95 reduction on that saddle looks like, to make sure that it's doable. So what we've got on here is some fairly new strings. The other thing I'm going to do is let's just tune this up a second before we do anything else. Okay, what I was going to do is just check the first fret action, which is a little high, and that's the other thing that one set. So the three components of the action which I like to set on a guitar, whether it's acoustic, electric or otherwise, is the neck relief, which we checked a minute ago, and it's nice and it's small as I'd like it for this. Now measurement in real terms, if I put the cap on and measured it, is probably about 0.2 millimeters at the midpoint of the neck. But again, this is one of those things that people often ask, you know, exactly what measurement do you go for, and Fender says this and Taylor says that. Really the truth is I go for what I know works as a nice playing setup. I don't go for what somebody says in a technical spec. And I wouldn't recommend that you do either. There's not really much value in going pouring through the PDFs and saying Taylor says X amount here. You can do it and set it to that's fine, but it's kind of almost more important that you experiment with it so that you get a feel for the way you like it, because nobody's technical spec in their PDF of numbers is going to be per your playing. The bottom line is you can play a neck that's set flat. You can't play one that's set convex because it's the strings will catch in the middle, right? Then you won't be able to play it. You can't fret anything down here because they'll hit the frets here. But providing it's flat, then, and you've got a bit of height here, then you can play any guitar. If you have a very low action here and a very flat neck, you'll quickly discover where the uneven frets are, because the geometry of those angles is very small. It's that way around, isn't it? So the geometry is very low, so there's hardly any space. Now if the bridge is higher down here, then you've got a bigger angle and more clearance on the strings. So the lower you go with the bridge, the less forgiving the frets are going to be with your flat relief. So it's if you want a flat relief because you like the way it feels, and you want a low action, then you have to be even more. It's even more likely that you have to level the frets, even on a guitar like this, if that's your combination of things. However, the reason there is some relief in the neck is for the string to spin more near its center, which actually is technically offset from the neck center, but the idea is that if you have a curved neck, that there's some more space about here, so that when the string spins more about here, you've got almost connected up, that there's a bit of room. So it's a combination of those things. So when Taylor says X amount of relief, you can follow that, and then I would recommend you alter it and see what works for you. Now I've got a feel for it for me, which is if I hold the first and last fret down and I look, first of all, is there a gap there in the middle? Yes, I can hear it, I can see it. How much is that gap? Well, from experience it's about 0.25. That's fine for me. So that's how I do it. But Taylor might say 0.35, in which case start with that, see how it feels. Then adjust, take it out, flatten the neck a bit more, see how that feels. But if you're going to do a setup, start with a measurement that you're ideally that you're comfortable with from other guitars you've played, okay? Which is how I'm doing it. So 0.25 to 0.3 relief around the middle fret here is I can see that visually is enough to work with. It's not going to be so much that it feels unusually high in the middle. The action here feels highest here because of the height of the bridge. All things considered, being equal, if you had a low action but lots of relief here, you get a feeling of a higher action in the middle because you've got a much bigger curve in the neck. And it's quite amazing how quickly how tiny an amount of relief change can lead to a sense of increased action here. Anyway, the point is that's an aside. What I'm looking for now is just to get a look at what the first fret actions are. So they're quite a lot higher than I would go for. They're about 0.6, something like that. And I'm going to repeat myself because I probably haven't said this for ages, and those who've watched my videos know this stuff, but what's the least you can get away with? Well, if you want to know that, put a capo on your guitar, and then you go, right, capo, lovely guitar, plays beautiful, blah blah blah, and then get your eyes and go, blimey, how big is that gap there for a set, for any given relatively low playing action down here, which actually this is quite high, but let's assume that was fairly low, and there wasn't bellying to factor in. But when you put a capo on a guitar, you look at it and you go, wow, that clearance over the first fret, obviously it's the second one, but now we've put a capo on, that's the nut, and this is the first fret now. You look at it and you can see that the clearance over the strings is much, much less than the clearance over the strings when you remove that. Now, obviously, the actual clearance over the first fret, when you've got the capo on, changes depending on how high this is. None of these things are interdependent. Sorry, none of them are independent. They're interdependent. But let's assume, for making this point, this is a reasonable height bridge. It's not stupidly high. What you'll see is that the actual on a fairly low set bridge, you might find that the action at the first fret, let's make a reasonably low set bridge. The action at the first fret is as low as about 0.1 to 0.15 of a millimeter, and yet when you take it off, we've just shown that it's over 0.4 heading towards 0.6 in some of these strings. Now the point of this is you could reduce these slots until this action was the same, 0.115, as when you have the capo on, right? And in fact, if this was a 0 fret, that's probably what you get, which is why 0 frets can be really good, because they give you a default nice low action. Nuts are always the problem. But this nut, to set a nut as accurately as a 0 fret does it is a very difficult thing, because a 0 fret does it by the geometry of the triangle, right? This string attached here going over that fret and ending up on that saddle, when it uses the first or the 0 fret as a start point, then there's just a progressive mechanical or mathematical increase in the clearance over the following frets until you reach the bridge saddle, the apex of the bridge saddle. And that height is mathematically kind of given from that triangle, the baseline versus the bridge height versus that back down to the 0 fret. And that, because it's a 0 fret and because it's fixed at this end, that gives it a very low first fret action, just like as low as if you put a capo on, because basically you're making the guitar into a 0 fret guitar when you put the capo on. And you can see that plays out very low, a little bit more, and so on until you reach the dizzying heights of the saddle, right? So the point is, when you come to look at a high action on a guitar like this, the first thing to say is that if it's higher than about 0.5, it can make you press the notes sharp. Right, now I'm deliberately exaggerating this, but right, particularly on open chords. And the higher it is, above about 0.5, you find that to press down to the frets, you will get this sharp, bending sharp effect occurring. And in a way, yes, it's partly technique, so you can go bend over backwards to avoid it, but actually it's also a factor of the height of the strings leaving the nut. So my point has always been, let's get rid of that potential detuning factor, because actually it's a real culprit in many people's experience of not being able to tune a guitar. And it's not, technically they are able to tune it, but they'll describe the experience of constantly tweaking it with a tuner, and then they'll play the chord and go, this doesn't sound right. Now I'm exaggerating it, because the actual first fret action on this guitar isn't so high that it's obvious to begin with. But on mine, when I first got it, it was, and it's what showed me how to set these a bit better, so that two things happen. One is that you don't get this out of tune sharpness from fretting the notes, particularly in cowboy chords as they're called. And the second one is actually when the first fret action is by default really low across the nut, you have a guitar that is suddenly massively easier to play. So try it by putting a capo on your favourite guitar and play that for a while, notwithstanding a high action at this end. But even if the action is quite high at this end, with a capo on at this end, it becomes 50% easier to play. Now it's pushing it slightly out of tune, and that's actually quite a good sign that that first fret action or the nut slots are still too high. If even putting the capo on throws this out of tune. If we had a second capo in here, we could tune this one up and then put a capo on it, and you'll see that because the capo isn't having pushed so far down, the next capo would be able to be put on and stay in tune. Anyway, so I've had lots of people come to me and say, I can't get the guitar in tune, and then we track it down to this problem, and it drove me mad for nearly 2 years until I worked it out, and that's what got me started in all of this. Anyway, so the point is, on an average action, you can get away, as the capo shows you, you can get away with a first fret action as low as 0.15 millimeters. Now I think that's a little bit, can be a little bit, well, it's not anything. You can play a capo all day long. But when I first started doing this, I backed away from that, and I said, tell you what, let's just make it 0.3 or 0.4. And I did it plenty of times, and I found that 0.3 stroke 0.4 was actually quite a conservative target to aim for, but it was a comfortable one to aim for. It gave me a little bit of margin for error, and still left me with a light playing guitar. So back to the beginning then. We've got some issues on this guitar. Humidity, bellying top, raises the action, starts to force the bridge off. That's a long-term fix required on that, which is this. It's a mid to long term, or take it to a shop. But assuming we're not going to do that, what we're going to do now is we're going to plan this for a longer term fix. But in the short term, we're going to reduce the playing action on this a little bit, as much as we can without compromising the tone, and we're going to make it easier and lighter to play at this end by reducing the nut slots on here to below the 0.5, and I would go for between 0.3 and 0.4. No, I've got it on mine. I've got actually a 2 millimeter action up here and about 0.3, possibly even fractionally less on here, and it plays beautifully as far as I'm concerned. When mine dries out, it will go quickly down below that 0.2. Now the great thing about acoustic guitars, by the way, sorry to rabbit on, is that you can often get a really substantial reduction in action, whichever way you choose it, whether it's through the shim here on this guitar, or can't do it with all guitars, or whether it's through the bridge saddle reduction. You can get a surprising amount of playing reduction, at least to the 2 millimeter mark, without encountering any uneven frets, and that's what's really good about it. Not the same with electric guitars. People who like low actions on the electrics typically like to go below the 2 millimeter mark on an electric. Quite often people want to get close to the 1 millimeter action, really fast and low. And below the 1.5 or below the 2 millimeter mark, you run into the uneven frets, and that's why on the electric guitars I pretty much always end up doing fret leveling to get the low action people want. And you know, some people come on my YouTube videos and comment that nobody plays with an action like that, idiot, you know, I play with a much higher action. Fine, you know, but funnily enough, an awful lot of people over the last 4 years have asked me for that 1.5 millimeter action, so you might not like it, but some people do. Anyway, so back to the beginning. Long term, dehumidify. Short term, reduce the saddle, get an improvement in action here, and then set the nut slots here, get a reduction in the action here to lighten this feel up. And a combination of those two things will transform how this guitar feels in the short term, but then it will go back to Neil with a caveat that this drying out process is going to need to go on over the long term, and it will result in the action going even lower, possibly to a point where it starts to buzz out on some uneven frets, because all guitars have them. But up until that point, they won't be factoring, or they will not be imposing themselves on affairs. But when that happens, then all we need to do is shim the neck. And I think Neil was saying that he might well be down in this neck of the woods anyway, no pun intended. And we can just do that change when it happens. But there we go. Right, so we've got our strings, and right here we've got somewhere here we've got a list of the gauges. Now these are pretty new, and you could just put these back on, but my feeling is if you're going to spend time and energy on a setup, and part of the thing is pulling the strings in and out of the slots and taking them out, doing some work on the saddle, putting them back in and tightening them up, that's going to put a lot of stress, winding off stress on these strings. So despite them being in good condition and new right now, there's no point in ending up with the guitar set up the way we want, but with older and slightly stressed strings on there. Let's go for new strings if you're going to invest in setup time on the guitar. Okay, so right back to the beginning, 3 points of action. First of all, the neck relief. We've got it where I want it, about 0.2 millimeters. For me, that's a good start point. We're going to go with the same gauge string, so that isn't going to change. We can't adjust this right yet, but we do want it, and we also want to adjust this. Now, the point, keeping in mind, I said these three things are all interdependent: this action, and the curvature in the neck. If I set these where I want them, and then I massively relieve the neck, what's going to happen is this gap's going to open up slightly because the neck's going to curve away downwards towards the center of the neck and then back up at the end. So we'll get a slight increase in the action that we just set, or that is set by the nut slots. Okay, that's how that impacts those two. Equally, if we're happy with the neck relief, and we're not yet changed that, but we go and adjust the nut slots right now, I know that I'm also going to adjust that afterwards. All right. If I do it in that order, I could do it the other way around, but if I did it in that order, it means that if I really want to get to 0.3 millimeters on as my first fret action, I don't want to end up there first off, because I also know that I'm going to reduce this height a little bit afterwards, which is going to bring these a little closer. So if I go for 0.3, I'm going to be uncomfortably close to or below 0.3 by the time I've dropped the saddle. Okay, so you've got to. Now you might say to me, well, what's the exact mathematics? I don't know. You just have to guess it, right? And guess at how one affects the other. You could probably work it out scientifically, but I don't know anybody who would, and I certainly don't. So I have my figures in my head. I go let's say I aim for 0.4 on this, and then I take some down off the bridge, bridge saddle later on. So my 0.4 that I achieve now will go down to probably closer to 0.35 or even 0.3. Yeah, and I've said 0.3 is a conservative, nice, easy, all day long first fret action for electric and acoustic guitars. Okay, so that tells me that because I'm doing this second, and it's going to change things, I'm doing this first. If I go for safety on the 0.4, then when I come to adjust this down, I'm going to go down from 0.4 a little bit. All right. If I went for 0.2 here and then lowered that, I'm going to get this buzzing out on the first fret. So it's just about knowing about which order you're doing it. If I did it the other way around, and I said, okay, I'm going to leave that exactly where it is, I'm going to adjust this first, right? Then I can take this down. In fact, let's do it that way for the fun of it, right? And see how it works out. Let's say I'm going to take the bridge down, and then I'll end up with a height over the first fret, which I know has got to come down anyway, but let's take this one down first to where we're comfortable. But the point is, if we take this down to my notional 2.5 and 2, the reality is that when I take these down a little bit, that will go down a fraction on this. So this measurement, I'll need to stop just above the 1.5 and the 2. How much above? Suck it and see. Right. So I think I'll work with this end. It just feels to me easier to start at this end. Start with the aim of 4. This is going to reduce it a little bit, but hardly by any. They're opposite ends of the thing, but you see they are interdependent, and that's the important thing. Okay, so what I'm looking for first of all is my set of files. I might splash out on some new ones because I've got so many files here that are breaking in half, and some have got wiggles in them and stuff. So we've got the first one in the pile is we've got a 12, so I'm going to go for a 13. We've got 16, so I want something above each of these. Now straight away you'll notice, and this isn't ideal, I've only got 17 here, so go 13, 17, that's a bit close. I would prefer to go above those, but I don't have something that does it. I've got a range of things, and if I bought another set I probably would have a better I better go at it. But as long as it's above, that's what I want. And the reason I want it above is because if you do it at the same size, you will end up with the strings sticking, and you'll have to widen them by hand anyway. So why not start a bit wider? And I'm just doing it from experience. I would be happy if that was a 12, I'd rather a 14 or a 15, which I haven't got. And if that's a 16, I'd rather an 18, which I don't have. So I'm kind of compromising with what I do have, but as long as it's above, I'm good. But I also, like I said, know that I will probably have to do some work with the old sandpaper and a blade. So 16, we've got 17, 24. Now 24, I don't want a 24, I want a 28. All right. 32, I want at least a 36. And I'm going to go 42, I want 48. Wherever it's gone, the biggest old thing in the pile, 48. Now, above 48, I'm short because I haven't got one, so I'm going to use my bass guitar slot cutting thing, which one? The orange. It's the orange one that comes to mind. The orange one, which is about 52. So we go from 42 to 53, and then we'll just make sure that's good with some sandpaper. So it's a little bit of a combination of things here, but alright, so here we go. This is the fun. Want them at pitch roughly, but it's not. The main reason for having them at pitch is so that they sit, the strings that I'm working on will sit into the slot fully. Now what I'm starting with is my feeler gauge, double check it, I'm starting at 40. Okay, and there we are at 40, and I'm going to use a combination. This is where I've kind of, over the time, I've ended up using various things to do the same job. Now, have I got me, I do have a thing that can come a bit closer. Just to try and vary the view, because it gets boring for me to imagine how boring it must be for you. let's bring this thing in way closer or something. Sort of. It's all over the place. Who knows? It's going to fall over. That's going to fall over. Something like that. Just a slightly different view. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just over the 40 mark. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm pull it out, and just to begin with, I'm going to use this file to just widen the slot. Now Taylor are interesting because they always use a V notch, where a lot of people get really freaked out by that and go, oh, you can't have it, it's got to be a straight down, you know, what if the string you know, is ugly, it's not professional. The great thing about a V notch, which Taylor have realised, is if they do a V, let me say it a different way. One of the things I've never had a problem with Taylors is the strings sticking in the slots, and the reason why is they use this V on their nut. Other guitars that do a straight down slot with these kind of professional files end up binding. So I've kind of basically employ a combination of things. I use this file here for a little bit of a widening, but I have to make sure that in doing it I get the widening effect but without cutting the slot lower than I want. So I sort of get to a point where I then do the last little bit with the slot, the file of my chosen gauge. So as I can hear it, it's telling me it's not at the correct depth, and we get to know that it's at the correct depth at the point where it starts to choke on the feeler gauge. It's quite hard on the fingers to drag those strings around. Very close to it. I'm going to stop there. That's comfortably close. So, wasn't much. Now remember, it's comfortably close, but the G and the B are the actual G is quite a lot higher, so that's going to take more work. Here we are with the A string, and again I'm going to go with the widening file to begin with, and I'm always working slightly backwards, tilted backwards. Sometimes if you can't do this with your bare hands, get a piece of string, can really help to lift the string up and out. I mean a piece of paracord or something, not metal string. Of course, which I'm not doing now. And then you remember to switch out to the next gauge, which in this case is the 48, which is snapped off way in the past. So again, working back at about between 5 and 10 degrees backward angle, and how much you cut is experience based. You'll learn through doing if you follow this or do more of this. And there is always, of course, a risk that you go too far, which is why it makes good sense to A, go slowly, and B, start with a conservative, reasonably high up, that'll do, high up, 0.4 as a start point. That gives me plenty of room. I can go, if I absolutely screwed one up and went down by 1/10 of a millimetre, I could take the others down by 1/10 and would still have nice playing guitar if I wanted to. But I'm aiming for perfection, so now when you're doing this you can usually see the air gap. There's a space, the light shines underneath the string, between the string and the feeler gauge. Now I'm going to work with my, it's actually 53 this anyway, work with my 53 after I've done a bit of widening, again tilted back. Always, when you're doing this, always watch out for where your file is ending up, because it's quite easy for it to, not so much on a tilted back headstock, but on a Strat it's quite easy to hit the rosewood directly behind the nut. Sometimes you can't avoid it. It's just par for the course. Okay, still see a little bit of fresh air, but not that much. So you could probably guess that if you didn't want to spend bags of money on expensive files, you could probably guess you could probably get away with just the V notch file, that baby, because these strings, the guitar will play with just a notch instead of a, and I kind of show how I do that as a, let's see, look at that. I do this at a time I wimp out a little bit of fresh air, a little bit more. I don't know, I'm quite okay with that. Let's call those good. Again, quite a lot of intuition or experience coming in there, saying right, I'm happy with that. Now let's move this. All right, I don't know whether you're getting blinded by the lamp light there or not. Sorry if you are. I'm okay with this tusk material. It's not as easy to cut, in my experience, as bone. So sometimes on these tailors I end up replacing the nut with bone if it resists my attempts to cut down. The interesting thing about this is that the payoff of getting these nut slots to where you want them, as accurately as you want them, the payoff is so great. Payoff is so great that it's worth doing, but as I say, the amounts, measurements are so small. The distances are so small that you do find yourself sometimes needing to revert to a bone because it's more workable. Now this is quite easy to overcut at this stage. So be very careful. The slots aren't that deep, so I'm working now with the 17, and I'm going to just be very cautious. This is where the difference between bone and the tusk often shows up at this very last few. I get quite nervous because it's always that thing, you know, you get everything done right except the last one, and then you have to start again or throw it and put a new one on. Just on the mark. See, that's what I don't like about tusk, is it cuts in spurts, excuse the expression, but bone is cuts more dependably. I'm not really quite entirely sure what I mean by that, but I know what I mean by it. The number of times I have overcut on a bone, on a tusk nut far exceeds the number of times I've done the same on a bone one. And there has to be a reason, credible reason for it, and let the reason be, it's just the way it cuts. Like if this was bone now, I could feel confident at the speed at which it's cutting, and I don't know why, but tusk seems to speed up and slow down, whether it's different densities within the material or it gets warm and does something slightly different when it's warmer or when it's braided in a certain way. But I've gone past the mark on tusk way more times than I ever have on bone. Right, I'm going to stop there. Looking at the spaces. Well, that's not helpful, but okay, so that's that bit done, and now we're going to embark on the saddle game. And what time is it? Because I've got to go and pick my son up from I say the airport, but that isn't the word I'm looking for. From the station. Right, okay. So here's the next bit. You're on a funny angle now, aren't you just? Boink. Move you around. Okay, so this is where we kind of, the strings take a bit of a hit. So we know what the measurements are down here. So now we can slack these strings off. And we need to slack it off either completely off or at least far enough to get this saddle out. And sometimes, believe it or not, it can be almost, sometimes I get to the point you almost might as well take the whole lot off. By the way, these have been played a fair bit. I don't know, you won't be able to see it. You can tell that elixirs, when they get well played, they go a bit fluffy. They're nice strings, but you can spot it. Okay. And the other thing about elixirs is that there seems to be quite a rash of fakes out there on the internet, which is a real shame. And I've had a few in my time. Okay, this is going to be typical. This is going to require taking the strings probably off. Maybe, let's see. At least very slight. Yeah, I've had quite a few, or some, fake elixirs in my time, and I have to say the problem is when you do get them, and you get them from internet sellers. The sellers typically have been good enough to send another pack, sometimes without even asking for the other ones back. But then they've just sent another pack from the same batch, which kind of makes you think. I don't think they're doing it on purpose, but it makes you think that basically they've got a whole batch of dodgy ones themselves. And in a way, keep asking for more doesn't really work out because you keep getting the same thing again and again, which isn't terribly helpful. Now, I'm just going to get a piece of hardboard. So here we have our bone saddle, and we've got, you can see it's compensated there, so we've got the I'm just going to write it on, I'll put a tiny mark on it because sometimes this gets, I'm going to put a mark on the treble end, right? Well, that's going to come off, isn't it? Dull. Let's put a pencil mark on it. No, what do I need to do? I need to put a sticky thing for now. Or maybe just a mark. I don't want to get it. I can see which way around it is. Anyway, right, so now we're going to do a measurement. I've left my digital things in the thing. Right, we're going to take 1.95 at one end, and we're going to have little millimeters here. Not very bright. I'll come there where it's a bit brighter. Okay, what did we say? 1.95. Let us begin with marking off 1.5 at the base end, and we said 1.3 at the treble end. Actually, let's be a little bit more close to the mark. We said 1.95, didn't we, at the base end? So let's at least have the courage of our convictions. There's 2. Fraction back from 2. And then 1.3 at this end. Again, it's a little bit on the hard to be 1,000,000,000% precise, of course, because everything moves, and then you've got the thickness of the line and your drawing and so on. But let's say to begin with we'll draw this line. So realistically it's nearly a well, it's 1.95 to 1.3. Again, it's quite difficult to draw it on top of bone, which is trying not to be very flat. Okay, so there's our line, and we can double check that. Now I can tell you now, if we took that off, then we end up with that correct amount. I'll use my other glasses for this, but yeah, that will give us the drop of 1.5 on the base side and 1.0 on the treble side. And again, I'll just double check the measurement. What end am I using? Okay. Yeah, brilliant. 1.3 and just on 2. Well, you can't get much closer than 1.95. Okay, so the question that we don't have an answer to straight away is, what happens if, do we know that this reduction will result in enough good break angle when we're done? And the answer is we don't know. I can be fairly confident that it will just by eyeballing it, but we don't know for absolute sure. So I always suggest anyway doing this kind of thing in 2 stages. Okay, so just to be holding up the thing, that's annoying. I'm going to do this in 2 stages, and the first stage is going to run along this edge. That's all those years as a designer, being able to hold a pen in a straight line. So I've done a kind of first run in marker pen, and then the second bit in let's follow through and take that off. And I can go around the edge here, just following the line round, so we know where our marks are. And it's not rocket science precision, but it's we're kind of walking our way towards what we want. We're not doing it in one massive chunk. Now the fun part comes with sanding down, and we've got 2 grades of sandpaper to work with on this, and the point being is, let's get the first reduction done and then go in and try it out on the guitar and make sure the first one is good. Now, my little secrets, for what they're worth, is when you're working with saddles, use a block and get yourself some foot space, because you're going to want to move from side to side. Now, what are we taking? We're taking more on this end than that end, so we're going to have a bias towards this end. So I'm going to put the bias on my right hand and I'm going to press down more. Whoops, that's stuck. I'll press down more for now on my right hand side, and I'm looking to see that the end or the bottom of this saddle is cutting square with everything else, and if it isn't, then I'll adjust it, but right now it's fine. And what I tend to do is move my whole body as much as possible as opposed to the piece, so I can keep that angle. I keep switching it over and looking, and let's have a look close up. Okay, so I still need a little bit more of an emphasis on the base side, making sure it cuts a little bit heavier, sort of almost a 2-to-1 ratio really. So we get to the same places at the same time. So I'm just again eyeballing that down there, a bit more on the base side still. As I say, that kind of holding it in place and moving the whole body is quite useful, because you can really see that staying still. As you try and do it with your hands, you'll sort of start to change the angle quite a lot. Now it's okay at that end, but I've got a little bit of a back tilt at this end, which is the okay, straighten that up. Again, it's a lot to do with experience. Okay, so we're coming along slowly. You could, if you had a lot to take off, you could do it with, you could get the bulk, if you knew where you were going, you could get the bulk of it off with a file and then kind of slow down and bring it to the block at the last point when you're ready to fine smooth it, because the only way you're going to get a smooth base on this saddle is on the block, otherwise you'll never get it totally flat on the file. Okay, now I'm just looking at this, it's almost straightened up now, but I've just leaned a bit off centre, so I need to bring this back to a 90 degrees to get me a flat base. So it's constantly watching what the overall shape is doing. Okay, so we're now coming towards the halfway mark. You can see we've taken some stuff off there, and all the time kind of watching for the upright, making sure that's perpendicular to the block, and you can only really do that by stopping and checking and correcting if it's starting to lean. It's really important, this flat base thing. If it leans, you'll weaken or you'll reduce the integrity of the contact. Oh, actually, sorry, I was just going to say, not the case in this, because the contacts are inside with this one, but where it's an under saddle piezo, it's even more important that it's flat. It's important that it sits flat to transmit through the body of the guitar, but it's also important that the piezos they touch the side of this saddle, so it's got to be the right thickness as well. Okay, we're almost there for the first cut. Now this is why sacrificing this first set of strings is quite a good idea, because we can now afford to take this off and on a few times to get it right. Okay, we're at about the halfway mark. Just check there. I think we're rocking a little bit back towards me fractionally. Oop, and slip now and then. Okay, so there's my sort of halfway mark for me, and then I'm going to replace the guitar. If it gets grubby at this stage, and your fingers, oh yikes, sorry, let's try and get this thing to stand up a bit better. Sorry. You're still running? You are. Yeah, if the nut gets a bit grubby, then you can always clean it afterwards. Just Right now it's more about getting it to the right height, and then we'll clean it just right at the end before we put it back in finally. Okay, so let's have a feel of this. If it's we'll see, this will give us a gauge. We're probably halfway, maybe a little bit over, so we can gauge what the action's like, whether the angles tolerates a bit more reduction, or whether we're where we want to be in terms of the tone and the playing action. I'm not too worried at this point in time how the strings sit around the tuner pegs. Just want them on. Okay, let's have a look. Still higher than I'd like, obviously, since we were aiming for a specific action, but it's a good moment to stop and feel it. Bone dust, it's alright. Out of tune, of course. Just checking then the angles of the dangles. Now at this point on the E, we're getting to where I don't want to go any further down on the E in terms of break angle, so let's see what we've got. We're on 2.5, it's a little higher than I would like, obviously. Well, I say that, but I'm being overcautious. So I don't know how well you can see, but if we go too much lower on the high E, what we'll end up with is not as much contact over the saddle as I'd like. Now at the moment it's still enough, and I've gone probably a little bit lower on my guitar, but I'm not that keen on doing it on this one. And it's interesting because I don't know why. Oh, it's because this is, yeah, of course the radius seats this lower anyway. The question I've got is, I've got quite a bit of break angle room, so this is on nearly 3.5. We've not actually gone down that far, so we can afford to go down some now on this bass end, because none of these are in particularly well. Actually, no. You know what? That's an interesting one, because I don't really want to go below that on this. I have done, as I said, on mine, but when you get to the E's on this, you get get a bit flatter across the top. The other strings, because of the nature of the saddle rising in the middle, they have obviously a better break angle, but the E's are as far down as I want to go at this stage. Well, let's have a look. Let's do something else. Let's do a little bit of combination stuff. Kind of let's see. I don't really think I've got any. I don't think I've got any shims of any wedge. Have I got some wedge-shaped shims at all? I might have one or two, but I'm not sure they would work in this context. I'm short of getting tailor-made ones in. Let's see. Okay, well, we've got the nut action right. We've got the action as low as we can go without diminishing the break angle and starting to lose tone. So that was about the halfway point of my target reduction, but it's just the way it goes. Let's see, let's have a look. It'd be great if Taylor actually provided people with a range of shims. No doubt you have to go and buy them, spend a fortune, but let's put this on the ground. Now, this is the beauty of the Taylor design. It's designed to come apart like this. And it's a good little thing for travelling, but it also allows you to do it's like shimmings and modifications. So come on out. Thank you. Put that there, put those over there as in the right order. So there we have our Taylor shim. Can you see it? There it is. It's got, I'll do that up as well. It's got something written on it, 20, and it, as you can see, oh I see, it's graded, so it's not right down to a thingy point. I could probably make one of these quicker than I had expected. Let's have a look. Wasn't planning to, like. See what we've got in our box of stuff. I mean, the problem is we need to increase the angle, not just raise the whole thing up. So it has to be a taper. If I've got one, no, that's not taper. I was thinking if I had one ready, left over from something else, it would be worth a try. But I have one that's not a taper either. So yeah, the choice. Oops, the choice in this is to either. Now where's that one gone? That was probably the best one I could have used. Excuse me 1 second. Right. Dig around under here. Where did my shim go? There it is. Maybe not. I wish I had a shim making kit for these things. So that's the kind of size-ish. Something to start off with. That's a 3-ply one. That's two. It's going to be way too big. So the challenge is getting the thin enough thing, but one that is also tapered. And I don't think I have any more that are tapered. Well, there's one similar size, but this could end up taking me a lot longer than I had anticipated. But so what we need in principle is to basically raise up this raise up this shim and thicken it at one end. Now the simplest way to do it would be to put something under it at one end. Well, yes, I mean I've done it on other guitars like this. In fact, I might just do that just to kind of make the point, because the thing is, if this is under there, it's going to stop that deforming. I don't think there's any real risk of that, frankly. Now here we have some different materials. Let's get a bit of. It's a bit big. Let's try that one. That's probably too thick. Okay, we have in here. It's hard to know what you need before you get going. That's the thing. So we have a little bit of copper. Okay, so we could just cut that to size. Or better yet, it needs to be flat. Really, come along. The thing is, like I say, it's kind of guesswork really. It's got to be one end and not both, because you need the raise. And short of making one of these, the nice thing about this, if you were to make your own, you don't have to go right down to the thinnest edge. But you do obviously have to, basically you'd have to kind of copy this shim, which is pretty much that one, that thickness there. But I would have to work that into a thin thing. I mean, the other way we could do this is probably just as easy to take a chunk of this and cut this out. So that's about the right thickness. Use my own thing as a thing. Let's see what that comes out as. This is wengy. I use this quite a lot for these sorts of things. It's quite handy because you can make a number of layers and make up a thickness of your own choosing. I think I'd prefer that than sticking some copper, although it's probably a little less convenient than copper. Right, so what I'd do is I would, off camera, let's have a look at this. It's almost custom built. I'm going to round off the corners. So nothing sticks out. Shedding a bit there. Okay, so we have, oh look, we have a little bit of sticky uppy. So we could pop that in there, as they say, and plop that on there. Now we have a shim of sorts, but the truth is, it's a little bit. We'd really want to do the where's it gone? The whole chamfer thing, and then the whole thing gets much bigger. It's quite a tricky. That's the problem. You either remake another one with a of the same dimension but with a thicker. So we go. I haven't got my micro thing. So we get one at this end that's exactly that thick, and this one add a millimetre at the other end, or we we build this one up, but we can't do that. Yeah, like I say, the only other way of doing it is putting a single piece under there, a single shimmer piece, which will be kind of like this, only much thinner. So we can break this in half, or cut it, it'll be easier. But then it still leaves a little bendy gap. What would you do? What would you do? What would you do? So back to the good old-fashioned electric guitar style shim. Really, that does everything. The classic shim does everything you want it to do. It just kicks up the end of the guitar at reasonable amount. Now that's, if you look at it, that's probably too much of a kick. Come on out of there, would you? Come on. Such a snug fit. It's probably too high a kick. So we probably are down back to the dimensions of the little bit of metal, which is kind of where probably I should have stayed in the first place. Let's just try that and see. And then in this case the amount of lift is so small, and we will be temporary hopefully, because we need to take it out again at some not too distant future date. That's the idea. Like I say, some people have got get quite uptight about the nature of a shim. There was like I said, there was a whole argument, somebody arguing that the presence of a shim would cause the whole of the neck heel to in some way or other warp, but it's very difficult to see how that will be, especially given that the pressure is on the non-shimmed end of this neck. As you can see, it sits in like this. It's a very small amount, so let's see. So it'd be nice to have a means of making multiple wedge shims, some machinery to do it. Anyway, the idea is hopefully this will come out once the dehumidification of the top helps to lower the bridge somewhat. There. Let's just have a quick look as a check. Strings akimbo. Can you still see from there? Okay. It was difficult putting on pre-strung strings. They never want to play. Much nicer. So that could be, let's just do one more thing. That could be just about spot on as an action. There are those who are going to say, quite rightly, why did you not just start with the shim? And the only reason I went to the shim is because in practice it became obvious that, and it's hard to see without doing your first reduction in the saddle, it became clear on the first reduction of the saddle that I wasn't going to get to wear a good playing action without doing a shim. And you know, from a customer's point of view, if they want a guitar that plays the best it can play, what I don't want to do is do the most, what's the word, intrusive thing first. So part of that was part of the process in that is to can I get to a decent action without working with any shims, and then if it fairly quickly becomes clear that no, you can't, because of the shape of the top, the bellying of the top, then okay, let's do something with a small shim. And this is probably about a 0.35mm sliver of brass. Now, technically, that's not very good. Technically, you could now say that this would benefit from being shimmed on the saddle. But again, if you remember, we could do that if it needs it. But the point being here is all of this is is sort of a short-term thing, because in the longer term we hope that the reduction in humidity brings the bridge down again. Oh, stop blinking at me. That'll be my son saying I'm getting on the train now ish. Got to go and get the spare room ready too. This has all been bumped late today because of parcel force failing to come till 5 hours after it should have done, which cost me sitting around time. When you've got a guitar for a customer to go out, you can't afford to move away anywhere for risk of missing the parcel force man. Of course, I had it all kind of lined up for a 24-hour delivery, thinking, yeah, I'll be there tomorrow, and then somebody reminds me that it's bank holiday. Which, as a non-religious person and a self-employed person, is easy to lose sight of. Right, I think we're at exactly the right action. I think. Yep, I'm happy with that. And we've got down to just over about 2.2. It's just a little under where I aimed for in the first place, thanks to the that's thanks to the slight vagary of doing a shim when I didn't expect to do one. But there you go. So that's the interesting bit. So let's just recap. Shimmed it because it became apparent that to reduce this anymore, to get a temporary playing action in the context of this having a bowed or bellied top, was going to cost us the downforce, downward, the brake angle. You've got a bit of leeway, but go away. You've got some leeway, you can do some adjustment, but you have to make a judgment call when you think it's going to reduce the downward force on the saddle. Now that has now, having done a combination of shim and some reduction, that happens to have come out perfect, and in a little way it's almost, I wouldn't say luck, it's kind of instinct probably. So having just done that, I'm now going to take these old strings off, and we're going to go into the process of cleaning the fingerboard, putting some oil on, and then putting some new strings on. And the next thing to do after that is a matter of stretching them out carefully, not too much. The problem with stretching them out on an acoustic like this is, sorry, not an acoustic, with Elixir strings, they're expensive, and if you break the top E, you're in for another pack or something, and it's just a horrible cost inefficiency, which we don't want to get into. So I'm going to be a little less aggressive on the stretching than I tend to be when I'm doing electrics. Okay, so this is a way I do this, very gently, just to loosen these off so they move, and then hopefully they come out. These strings I will probably, in fact not probably, I will just chop up, because they're a short scale, so they're not really good for anything else other than another Taylor baby sometime down the line. But since they tend to obviously come with their own strings, and the idea is that you pretty much always cut them off and use the existing ones as sacrificial strings, these can get ready for being chopped up. I've got my little tin of metal waste here. I'm trying to separate out the metal from everything else, paper and stuff. So I've got a tin, and I cut up all my strings and put them in the tin. Now we've got a loose strap button here for starters, so let's just take care of that while we're in the mood. And once this is done, I'm going to go in and get the spare room ready for my son. Let's do this downwards. Okay, that was good. The contact is still good, it just needed a little bit of tightening. I wouldn't expect it to be so old that it was stripping out. Okay, so let's give everything. I'm going to avoid using any solvent on this guitar. The reason why is I'm nervous about Taylor's solvent, Taylor's lacquer, or the finish they've used, because on some of these Taylors I've had, it's kind of melted away almost to a sort of sticky something, and I'm not completely sure, but it's very robust, so I don't want to be chucking naphtha on it. Now don't mind that. I know that the ebony is pretty good, and you can clean the ebony with this stuff. I mean, you can clean just about any poly and nitro lacquer with nitro finish with this Coleman's mustard. No, Coleman's cleaning kitchen. No, cooking fluid. But like I say, I'm avoiding the Taylor finish just because of how it's reacted to sweat on people's oldish guitars, other people's older guitars. I've had more than several that have come through with a sort of stickiness where human sweat has kind of dissolved the lacquer, but not like the sort of the old apocryphal Rory Gallagher tales where, you know, it used to eat the finish and spit it out. On these, it just turns it into a slightly soft goo that you could just remove with your fingernails, which is quite worrying. I'm just going to do a very light bit of oil and wipe this off again, just as a so you can see that in my case, by luck or by experience, some experience, that I got the right combination of or the right shim to go with the amount I'd taken off the saddle. But obviously you can see that if we went about it from the scratch, if we knew that from the outset that we couldn't reduce the saddle anymore, then it would have been a shimming. And some of the other tailor babies I've done, have had to be shimmed from the outset. But in this case, it's a combination of both. And in a way, it's probably a good thing because it keeps the size of the shim down to a minimum. Which, as I said before, if you go by, some people who are very nervous about it, they would say, the smaller the shim, the better. Now, the secret of getting acoustic guitar strings into the hole is, I don't know if it's a secret, but it's not easy to do. Sometimes they just don't want to get in there and stay. Like this one just wants to fly out. So I'm going to pull back a fret's worth and wind it on, holding the held bit so it goes over the top of the loose bit on the first trip round, and then try to send it, direct it underneath the loose bit on the second time round, and then go back to this end and make sure this fella's sitting in there. As it gets under tension, it will settle down, but it's not cooperative to begin with. Okay, so yeah, and I was going to say it's not entirely luck that the shim was the right size, because those shims happen to be cut and hanging around because I've used them before, or I've used the material because it tends to be the right gauge of material to do a one-off shim on electric guitars. So that 0.3 tends to give me a millimeters lift, or whatever it turns out to be, on the head, on the fingerboard at the neck body join. So you kind of you typically end up having around you the things that produce the right effects at the right time. Anyway, so you can see nice new elixirs going on here. All I have to do with these now is to stretch them out as gently as I possibly can, and then we can have this guitar ready to go back. I know that Neil needed it before the 7th of April, so we're well ahead of the game, but I wanted to get this one done today because I've got quite a lot on, and I didn't want to be having aircraft circling over the runway of life, if you know what. Sorry, you're getting hit by strings at this point. Okay, that's a very nice action, but it is temporary, and there are two things. Well, I mean, the good thing about this is that, as mentioned before, that Neil can bring this when he's in the area if he wants to. If the drying out is successful and he wants to make another action adjustment, which you might have to do if it's successful, because, as I said, that will, if it goes well, then the bridge will, the belly will reduce and the bridge will go down with it. That's a mark of success, so we are hoping that that's going to be the case. And if so, then we'll be in the luxury position of needing to either remove this shim or increase the height of the saddle, or both, depending on how successful the dehumidification process is. This looks much better. Oh wow, tons better. Some people, purists, on their expensive tailors would have a fit at using something that isn't a tailor approved shim bought from tailor at whatever the cost of their bits are, but it depends, you know, if you want to send this, or if you want to take your guitar to a tailor approved fixer and then send away and pay for the series of shims that you're going to throw away anyway, because they're going to ultimately end up being redundant when you've reduced the bellying top. That's, I don't know. For me, this is not in that category of spend, this guitar, but you know, that's it's got to be a customer's choice, really, I suppose. If this was a £800 or £1,000 one, I might say, okay, it needs shimming with a Taylor shim. It's going to take a few weeks to get, possibly. Will cost X amount, and then will need to be taken out as and when you've dehumidified the guitar. Okay, so important point at this stage is make sure everything's pressed in the right place. Throw away the packaging, go searching for the small clippers, biters, choppers, snippers, and then we're going to take off the excess stringage, which is just getting in the way and ruining the clean lines of this guitar. And I like to get them close to the post, so that they don't sting us and draw blood at any point. There we go. Keep an eye on these pegs so they don't leap out. Now, that's a great action. First thing is we're going to get some stretching, obvious stretching, and I'm partly doing this first because I'm just trying to make sure that all these pegs are staying in. There's nothing worse than when you start to stretch and tighten up that one of these pegs pops out and everything just goes skyward. So let's get this secure. Okay, get me a note for starters. Right, next part, or the final part of the process, is to do the thorough stretching with the side-to-sidey thumb and forefinger push, all the while keeping an eye out on the pegs, making sure nothing's going to pop out, everything's tightening up and settling down nicely. This guitar, obviously because it's a bank holiday weekend, it's not going to go anywhere now, but it will go back in its case. It will go into mine and the wife's bedroom with a few other guitars while you've got guests, and then I'll actually get the dehumidifier going straight away. It's a very slow process with these packet ones, and I wouldn't expect any noticeable change over the weekend. Beautiful. That's gonna be. Who's that? Who's that? Who's this? Who's that? Who's that? Who? Who's talking to me? I'll do one more stretch and then we'll bag it up, Dano. We haven't seen Morris's mum for about 2 months now, maybe a bit more. So sometimes when I hear a calling cat, I wonder if it's her come back to. Usually she comes back full of scabs and injuries and starving and skinny, and then she stays and fattens up and recovers for a couple of months and then clears off again. And I kind of like, in some ways, I like that independence in her. No, but this is in fact Morris. I'm not disappointed, Morris. Beautiful. Right, a little bit off-piste with that. But there you go. Taylor Baby. Oh, I'll give you another look from the side. Taylor Baby, BT2 mahogany. I think you probably even be able to see it from here. That's a very different action than before. But with the doctor's recommendation that it gets dehumidified and that we see it again as the action reduces, and as the action reduces we're going to expect to see a reduction, as it dehumidifies we're expecting to see a reduction. These are the reduction in the playing action. Sorry, I'll finish my sentence one day. These are designed for hanging in the wardrobe with its little watery. Well, look, you can get a measuring. I've extracted 250 millilitres of water. Well, if that were the case, you'd be the guitar would have been in some trouble. Now, I didn't do this on mine because I didn't have the green wire kicking about at the time, but I'm going to take the green wire, if I can get an end. I can't find an end. I'm going to make an end on this green wire, a start and an end. There's an end, there's a start, and I'm going to use this by throwing that on the floor. I'm going to sort of use this to maketh me, as it's raining outside and this humidity now is probably ruining guitar. No, I'm joking. I'm going to tie a little knot in here, and I'm going to use this to suspend this off the tuning. No, what's that thing called? Come on. Strap button. Thank you. The strap button. And I'm going to tie this on here. Twist it and whatnot, and then I'm going to, I don't know how well you can see this, if at all, probably not at all. I'm going to put this on front. It's not perfect. I mean, those of you might say, well, we don't really want it hanging in front of the strings, but actually it's not a bad place. There's a bit of springiness, and I'm going to dangle that. It's almost perfect. With my dangalicious thing, I'm going to now dangle that like that in the bag, and that's going to sit there and soak the water out of the top. And then ideally it would stand up in a room somewhere to do that, so in case it isn't going to get loads of water coming out, but in case it did, then the water is pointing downwards in the little collector bag as Mr. Taylor intended. No, Mr. Easy Hanging, or whatever his name was. There you go. Thanks for watching this one. A little bit non-standard, like I said, but playing it by ear as we go along and coming to a good outcome but one that is only a temporary one, as I said very clearly to the customer. Short-term action, tweak, long-term dehumidification, and return to a better playing action. So see you again soon for another one.